Ladies and gentlemen, I'm opening the first session, which is on Israel's legitimacy in the public discourse. A few procedural announcements. Each of the speakers, each of the four of us will speak 15 minutes. There will be 15 to 20 minutes afterwards for questions. You have on the table, you have cards on which you can write your questions, and the stewardesses will collect these cards. Well, as I am both the moderator and one of the speakers, I have to introduce myself. I'm the Manfred Gerstenfeld, chairman of the steering committee, the board of the Jerusalem Center. It would be a mistake to analyze Israel's delegitimization only in the framework of today's public discourse. When the State of Israel was created in 1948, the infrastructure and the tools for its total delegitimization were already in place. They had been built up gradually over almost 2 millennia. The delegitimization which happened in the last 60 years was mainly based on mutations of century-old hate motifs. The systematic delegitimization of Jews and Judaism has its origins in early Christianity. In the first centuries of the Christian era, the image of the Jews was promoted as the embodiment of all evil. Jesus was presented as the Messiah and God's Son and the representation of all what is good. Jews were presented as Christ killers and their descendants. It was impossible to invent in a Christian religious context a more effective motif to demonize Jews. The Christian challenge of Jewish rights also finds a theological framework of delegitimization. Jews are substituted as chosen people by Christians. In the 5th century, the church father Augustine creates a new, inferior, theological place for Jews in society. The Jews' position now is as a witness to the truth of Christianity. Thus, a full-fledged defamatory discourse has been constructed. Jews are the embodiment of absolute evil, theologically defranchised, and relegated to second-class citizens. To this construct, gradually, over the centuries, new defamatory elements will be added. The core motif of the Jew, being absolute evil, is slowly developed in more detail. In the 13th century in England, the blood libel emerges. 2 submotifs of absolute evil are now added. The first one is that the Jew needs blood for his religion. This recycles a pre-Christian Hellenistic theme. The second one is that the Jew lusts for the murder of children. Is there anything worse than intentionally killing children? In the 14th century, another submotif of the Jew being absolute evil is developed, that of the conspiracy theory, strengthening the accusation of the evil power of the Jews. When the Black Plague kills large parts of Europe's population, the Jews are being accused of having caused it. On this demonizing infrastructure, the various stages of the 3 major historic waves of anti-Semitism are constructed. The first stage is that of defamation and demonization. The second stage is exclusion. This entails exclusion by location, the ghetto. It embodies exclusion by clothing. The Jews are forced to wear different clothing, the best known of which is the yellow badge. It also entails exclusion by profession. The guilds do not admit Jews. This forces the Jews into few professions, the best one of which is as moneylenders. It creates another submotif of absolute evil, the Jews' lust for money. Defamation and exclusion, the first two stages, lay the basis for the third stage of all three anti-Semitisms, expulsion and/or murder. During the Crusades, it is murder. Later, in the Middle Ages, the Jews are expelled from most European countries. Now, having given this background of defamation and exclusion, one can read what one of the founding fathers of European culture writes about the Jews. Martin Luther asks, as part of the public discourse, quote, "What should we Christians do with this cursed and rejected race of the Jews? They live among us, and we know that they lie, slander, and curse," end of quote. Luther then goes on and recommends how the Jews will be excluded. Their synagogue should be burned, and what doesn't burn should be covered with mud. This must be done in honor of God and Christianity. Their houses should be destroyed, and they should live in stalls. Their books must be taken away. On punishment of death, their rabbis must be forbidden to give lessons. Their money should be taken away to help Jews who have been baptized. And one indication of Luther's impact is that a single bookseller in the 16th century orders as many as 5,000 copies of Luther's book to fill orders from France and Italy. It goes on. In the 19th century, the Rothschilds become the symbol of money and the Jews' lust for money, as if non-Jewish bankers were not interested in money. Around the beginning of the 20th century, the conspiracy theory of the Jews being absolute evil gets written support in a falsified document, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This lays the basis for the nationalist and racist societies of the 19th and early 20th century. The second major mutation of anti-Semitism develops, ethnic anti-Semitism. Also here, the Jew becomes the symbol of absolute evil. What can be worse in an ethnic-oriented society than belonging to an inherently inferior race, which means, in our terms, being genetically inferior? There is no escape clause here, like in religious anti-Semitism. There, at least, one could save oneself by converting to Christianity. Ultimately, Germany, under its democratically elected Chancellor Adolf Hitler, pulls it all together. Hitler plays an important role in European history, and he takes the ideas of another important European, Martin Luther, one step further. As said, the infrastructure has been built up over 2 millennia, thus now the process of defamation, exclusion and genocide can take place over a few years. The concept of all attacks are permitted and the assault has to be total has been modernized and industrialized. This delegitimization of Jews in the public discourse leads to the murder of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust over 3 to 4 years. Now, you will hear at this conference many lectures, and it will be difficult to recall what everybody says. So I ask you to remember of my presentation only 2 messages. The first one I've already mentioned. It is that if you continuously present people as the absolute evil, then all attacks against them are legitimate and the assault must be total. Against this historic background, we can understand the current public discourse of the total delegitimization of Israel. The issue is not, as has been said here, that after 60 years Israel's right to exist is still questioned. The issue is that the total assault on the legitimacy of Israel is increasing over the decades, as anti-Semitism has built up over the millennia. Ethnic anti-Semitism says that the Jews are of an inferior race. Anti-Israelism modernizes it by saying that Israel was born in sin. Shlomo Avineri has deconstructed it very nicely by saying that this being born in sin of Israel is contrary to all other nations which have been immaculately conceived. Israel's enemies claim that as Israel is born in sin, all it does is evil. Thus again, where we were already, all attacks are legitimate and the assault on Israel can be total. The old core motif of absolute evil is dressed up anew in this total assault against Israel, the Jewish collective. In religious anti-Semitism, the absolute evil was to be a descendant of a Christ killer. In our days, it is to be a Nazi. The accusation that Israel behaves like the Nazis is brought into the European mainstream by three leaders of European Labour parties. The first one is French President François Mitterrand. The second one is Greek Prime Minister Andreas Papandreou. And the third one is Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme. These three are the pioneers of mainstream Holocaust inversion in Europe. Israel is accused of all major evils according to today's standards. We have spoken about Nazism. The next one is apartheid. Israel is thus accused of being an apartheid state. To do that, one has conveniently to ignore that the blacks in South Africa were never offered a state, while the Palestinians have turned down twice the offer of statehood. One also has to forget that for the African National Congress, moderate violence was the last resort, while for the Palestinians and their Arab allies, major violence has always been the first resort. It is probably also because Israel is an apartheid state that you can read every day that African refugees risk being killed by their Egyptian brethren in order to leave Egypt to find a refuge in the apartheid state Israel. What else is evil in the eyes of the politically correct? Colonialism, of course. To accuse Israel of being a colonialist state, one has to ignore that colonial empires were built in order to bring home money from the colonies. The Jews, however, have invested much money in this country. The old submotifs of anti-Semitism have been recycled as well. Jewish power has mutated from the imaginary elders of Zion to AIPAC and the Jewish lobby. One wonders then why there are so many condemnations of Israel in the General Assembly of the United Nations. But delegitimizing Israel is not only a matter of recycling. Also, old material is being reproduced. The false protocols of the elders of Zion are a bestseller in the Arab world. If one is not biased, however, one realizes that there are indeed in today's world people who conspire to take over that world. These totalitarians are not the Jews, but they are the adherents of jihadic Islam, who realize the protocols of the elders of Mecca. Another recycled theme is that the Jewish lust for money. It so happens, however, that the ruler of Abu Dhabi controls the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world. This Abu Dhabi Investment Authority Fund has more than 30 times as much money as the world's richest Jew, Sheldon Adelson. I have dealt with some of the classic submotifs of absolute power, or absolute evil. Power, money, conspiracy. What about today's Jews' lust for murder? Daniel Pipes has shown that the Middle East conflict is not the most bloody conflict since 1950, but only number 49 on the list. What then about the anti-Semitic motif of intentionally killing children? Those of you who have followed the Mohammed al-Dura affair know that this icon of Palestinian accusations against Israel was not killed and then intentionally by Israel as the Palestinians claimed, but most probably by the Palestinians themselves. I could go on for hours about many more fallacies in the total attack on Israel. How Palestinian hate-mongers present Palestinians falsely as the true Holocaust victims. How Palestinians have become the true chosen people according to some of their Christian theologians. How, the more so as Jesus was a Palestinian and belonged 2,000 years ago to a people which didn't exist 50 years ago. I could also speak about how human rightists apply double standards against Israel, and many of these human rightists have in the meantime become human racists. To conclude, there is profound delegitimization in the public discourse of the Jew today as a religious person, as ethnically inferior, and as part of the Jewish collective Israel. These are phenomena which are now deeply ingrained in Muslim culture and parts of the Western one, mainly in Europe. And this brings me to my second message, which I would like you to remember from this presentation. Israel will not go anywhere in the field of public diplomacy if its government remains following a policy of verbal vegetarians. We have to start to expose our enemies' racism, and the accusers have to be turned into the accused. How you can do that, you can read in many of the JCPA's publications. Thank you for your attention. It's now my pleasure to introduce the second speaker. Support the vilest hatred and incitement. The Jewish people have this exposure to thank to Gerald, who has really taken the initiative and consistently attacked all these false NGOs who abuse the Declaration of Universal Human Rights. Professor Gerald Steinberg is the chair of the Political Studies Department at Bar-Ilan University, founder and director of the program on conflict management and negotiation, and the executive director of NGO Monitor, and I'm glad to ask him to speak.
Thank you, Manfred, for those very kind words. Thank you to the JCPA, who have together supported the NGO Monitor project from the beginning and really made it possible for us to develop the kind of research and publications and increasing impact. And thanks to my colleagues at NGO Monitor, this is clearly not a one-man show. And there's a great deal more work to be done. In the 15 minutes I have allotted, this will be one of the quickest 15-minute presentations that I've done. That'll go through a lot of material quickly. Some of it will be familiar to you. Some of it, I hope, particularly to European diplomats, will be new and disturbing. And there will certainly be plenty of opportunities in the next few years to develop a lot of these themes further. I am grateful that I am able to present this at the beginning of the conference, because I think the role of groups that proclaim themselves to promote human rights, to promote humanitarian assistance, to be charities, groups like War on Want and Christian Aid and Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. If I went to the list, I'd use up all my 15 minutes and more. These groups are very much at the forefront of the delegitimization of Israel. And the Durban strategy, the process that we saw not began, but reached a very important high point in the terms of articulating the use of this kind of terminology, of this rhetoric, of morally based claims to delegitimize Israel on each of these fronts, took place in the Durban Conference of September of 2001. The term Zionism and racism was brought back to life in full force. And at that conference, where we had 1,500 non-governmental organizations, including all of the superpowers, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, FIDH from Paris, all of these groups were very active. Adallah, many of the groups that are financed and work out of Israel, and of course across with the Palestinian Authority, articulated this agenda, put the terms apartheid, racism as descriptions of Israel, the terms ethnic cleansing, acts of genocide, the accusations against Israel. This was not a one-time event that we can forget about in the Durban Conference of 2001, but it was the articulation and the foundation of the campaigns that we see every day. We saw 2 weeks ago a report by 5 major British charities, including Amnesty and Christian Aid, that declared Israel to be committing collective punishment in Gaza. Terms, not only was it an abuse of international law, but many of the facts were simply wrong. This was not an isolated event. This happens over and over again. It is largely accepted. It gets printed by hundreds of newspapers. It gets into all the mass media, and almost nobody stops and checks and asks, is this accurate? Are there double standards here? And we see this is becoming very much rooted in the process, the war against Israel through delegitimization. The Lebanon War is one particular episode. There are many of them, but I think the illustration of the way in which these organizations work became very, very clear during the Lebanon War. We saw it in Jenin. We saw it in Operation Defensive Shield. As I said, we're seeing it now in Gaza. We are at the beginning of another round, apparently, a wave of NGO attacks on Israel through the issue of housing demolitions. And Amnesty is circulating now letters and articles that make patently false claims. We didn't have time to put this on top of the in the PowerPoint, but you see waves in which you have dozens of these organizations all using the same type of language. And the Lebanon War, as I said, is one illustration of many. In a 6-week period in the Lebanon War, we had over 100 statements by NGOs, almost one a day for Human Rights Watch, except on weekends. Amnesty International started a little bit late, but quickly reached the same level. The language is almost always the same. 90% of these were directed against Israel. Only a very few criticized Hezbollah, and very often in very softer terms, as we'll see in a minute. The language that we see, the language that we continue to see in the condemnations, disproportionate force, war crimes, indiscriminate bombing, collective punishment, violation of international law. Now, in almost all of these cases, there are no definitions for these terms. They are used inconsistently. Israel is singled out. These are all double standards. But they are picked up by the United Nations. They are picked up by the media. They become headlines. We hear them from diplomats. They are repeated. They become part of the background information. Nobody questions them. And look how the propaganda war is run by an organization called Human Rights Watch, which has a budget of about $50 million a year. I know that Foreign Minister Livni's not here. I won't ask her what the budget for the Foreign Ministry for countering this is, but it is certainly less than 10%. These are put out in glossy brochures. They are handed out in press conferences. They are given all sorts of amplification. And what is the title of the main report? I said Human Rights Watch put out a statement almost every day. They put out one 45-page report in the middle of the war, the beginning of August, and the title was Fatal Strikes, Israel's Indiscriminate Attacks Against Civilians in Lebanon. Almost every word there is part of the war of delegitimizing Israel. There is no criticism of Hezbollah. This was clearly a war that Israel began, that Israel is using every possible illegitimate means to wage. That's the impression that one gets. The front cover, I don't know if it's staged or not, but this is supposed to represent, and may be a picture of the coffins that Hezbollah put out in Kana, one of the major events of the war, which forced Israel for 48 hours to suspend air operations from claims which were very, very unclear. Initially, Human Rights Watch sent out headlines that there were dozens of deaths. A few days later, they cut the number down to 28. Nobody knows, in fact, how many people were killed, but the propaganda value was very clear. And I would argue that, in fact, this type of activity is more powerful in the role of the military because it can stop the military. And that's what we saw in this case. It was published in Arabic, it was published in French, it was published in Hebrew. It was clearly had major, major impact. And as I believe it was Bernard Kalbs at Harvard University who published a study. This was the critical media event of the war. It was the one that most people remember, and the journalists in almost no cases went back and revisited afterwards to note how they reported false information when this was released. This is Amnesty International's version, not a major report, but the language is almost the same. Again, the deliberate destruction, Israeli attacks on civilian infrastructure, and then a specific reference to the 48 hours. I guess we had a problem with his Hebrew-English translation there, but we'll fix that in the next round. This is a Amnesty. I'm just going to go through a number of examples and show how this NGO war gets waged until Manfred cuts me off. This is 40 years after the 1967 war. Amnesty, another major report, similar type of process, glossy report, lots of illustrations. Look at the front cover, very clearly staged to show you who are the suffering, how are they suffering. Look at the apartheid wall in the background there. This was widely distributed. The language that was used, the wall of death. You have Holocaust language, just as you have it in terms like collective punishment and war crimes. It elicits the images of the Holocaust and who are the new Nazis. These are the Israelis doing these terrible things to the Palestinians. You will note this was 40 years, not after the 67 war, not after the attempt, as Nasser put it, to push the Jews into the sea. None of that is there in the background. This is 40 years of occupation. The historical framework is totally erased when these processes take place, and what you're left with is snap pictures which are designed to increase the delegitimization. We see this in the agendas of these human rights organizations. In 2004, 2006, the attacks on Israel took up 1/3 of the entire human rights activity, Human Rights Watch activity on the Middle East. Far more than the case of Libya, Saudi Arabia, Syria. Israel is by far the largest violator of human rights. If you look at the resources that an organization like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, in fact the distortion is even greater. We don't have time to show the slides now. But the agendas that are set, and these are often set well in advance, the number of people, the number of research reports, and we'll get into the research and the quality of it in a minute, these agendas very much color the outcome. Israel, by all counts, must be seen as the worst violator. Otherwise, you wouldn't see this type of investment in the attacks that are made. Many of the reports simply are false in terms of facts. We have many of them. The number of reports, the number of press statements and other activities are far too many to go through in detail on each one. But if you pick many of them, you see the same process of using eyewitness testimony to make claims. And when you try to identify who are these people, what are their biases? In most cases, Amnesty International has one full-time researcher. Her name is Donatella Rivera. She does not speak Hebrew. I'm not sure she speaks any Arabic. She is responsible for running Amnesty's research. These are the kinds of reports that they put out. And how do they do it? They find eyewitnesses. Usually, if it's in southern Lebanon, people who are associated with Hezbollah, one would have to assume it's in Gaza. Who is going to give Amnesty testimony about the terrible things Israel's doing? Who are likely to be these eyewitnesses? And we see this happen over and over and over again. And when you try to confirm it, as Alan Dershowitz did, you come up with the conclusion that these are anecdotes, these are carefully chosen in order to make the case, rather than trying to prevent a factual set of images. Human Rights Watch also in many cases uses eyewitnesses. It uses claims from local NGOs, each of which have their own agendas and biases. They often will take the material from B'Tselem on Palestinian casualty counts, which will tell you that Israel is responsible for killing a large number of Palestinian civilians. How does B'Tselem know this? Largely because they'll either get it from Palestinian officials or they will get it from Palestinian eyewitnesses. Can this information be checked? No. It gets repeated, it gets picked up by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, it gets buttressed by eyewitnesses, it gets quoted in every report by Reuters, the number of Palestinian casualties, or the number of Israeli-Palestinian casualties, and the message is Israel is, again, indiscriminate killing. They report indiscriminate fire. Look at how many times that term comes up in these kinds of reports. There is no terrorism in this context. There is no reason for Israel to be using military force, and every claim that Palestinians have of casualties must be the result of Israel deliberately trying to kill Palestinians. And that image that Manfred talked about, the blood libel, gets reinforced over and over and over again, to the point where it becomes accepted wisdom in the United Nations, in diplomatic corridors, in the journalists, and by others. Often we see this mixed with classical theological and anti-Semitic themes. At Christmas time, around the issue of Bethlehem, it is the Israeli occupying forces who are indiscriminately harassing and mistreating the Palestinians. This is an image, this is a Christmas card that you can still buy from War on Want. It was on their website. this is the images that are, this is a charity, a large and important recognized charity in Britain. This is the Christian Aid version, not a Christmas card, but a poster and a major campaign of the suffering of the children of Bethlehem. And the narrative that goes with it is the Jews, the Israelis, are without any reason attacking and killing and wounding innocent Palestinians, and they become the substitute for the Jesus image. And these things get put together. This is an Oxfam poster with a blood orange, also calling for a boycott of Israel. War on Want, they take pop stars and bring them to photographic opportunities to be able to write graffiti on the wall where the language gets repeated, and that also has an impact. It gets on the website, and the younger generation very much gets pulled into this cycle of seeing Israel strictly in terms of delegitimization. NGO Monitor, what we are trying to do, and I do want to end on a positive note in saying that by naming and shaming exactly the same methods that the human rights organizations claim to employ, we are beginning to have an impact and forcing the organization, and more importantly, I think the funders, to take a look at what they're doing. We are engaging in dialogues. I think a great deal of the responsibility, and I say this to any European diplomats who are in the room, the responsibility for these activities also goes to those who provide them with the huge amounts of money. There are at least $150 million, it's not as many euros anymore, going into these organizations from government sources, largely from Europe, per year. Now, I don't know the exact amount because a large part of it is hidden. In our activities, we have a new report coming out on the EU funding of Israeli, Palestinian, and European NGOs involved in these kinds of radical political activities. You cannot find from the European Union an amount of how much they're giving. A large proportion of what they're doing is hidden, despite the European claim to promote transparency. The Europeans are good at preaching transparency, I mean the European Union in particular, to others. But when you try to find out what some of their NGO funding activities do and who they give it to, who they give money to, they get a lot of excuses. Some parts are now becoming more transparent, and they should clearly be much more transparent because there needs to be oversight in this area. There are many different offices, and when you look at who they're giving money to, many of these organizations are among the most active in using terms like apartheid, war crimes, collective punishment, and making false accusations against Israel. Across the board. And there has to be some sort of accountability here. And our report is hopefully the beginning of that process, a very detailed report, what's available, what's not available, and where the money goes, so that this can start taking place. We know it's already been raised in the European Parliament, and it needs to be taken further. I won't go into the details here again, and we have copies of the draft report if anybody wants it afterwards. But what we see is that at each level, at each stage, I get two more, good. I thought I was running out. At each stage of the process, European officials claim to be promoting peace, to promoting dialogue, but when you look at the people that they give the money to, and the organizations, Jeff Halper at the Israel Committee Against Housing Demolitions, that use the term apartheid in every appearance that they have, standing next to Naim Atik from Sabil, which is one of the most vicious anti-Semitic organizations, and providing that legitimacy. This is provided for by Europe. I'll take a quick lead into Trevor Asherson's comment in saying that the BBC goes very often to these officials for comments. So Halper is better known to a BBC audience than he is to Israel. He's funded by the EU. The same thing is true for Adallah. The same thing is true for dozens of organizations that are involved in this political process, this delegitimization. And there's no accountability. There's no address to go to the European Union and say, how is this process taking place? It is all very carefully hidden through the bureaucracy. As I said, this is beginning to become understood. We have more and more awareness among some journalists. It needs to go much further, that they need to check claims by NGOs just as they check the claims made by government spokespeople. If an Israeli government official or an American government official makes a statement, whether it's about Iraq or Afghanistan, there are claims of innocent civilians being killed, a good journalist will not simply take the word of a government spokesperson and saying this was a military target, there were no civilian casualties. They will go and investigate. But on NGOs, the halo effect still applies. You need to look at least as much at the NGO claims as you do with the government claims. And the journalists are beginning to do it. Serious journalists who are going beyond the facade and not simply repeating word for word the handouts of the organizations. The challenge that we have is to make sure that the damage that was done through the Durban strategy that underlies all of this, where the NGOs play such a critical role in 2001, is not just that it's not repeated in the Durban Review Conference of 2009. And there I think the Canadian government and Canadian officials get a great deal of credit for having pulled out and said, we will not participate and we will not support any NGO. We will not repeat our mistakes of 2001 by allowing our funding to be used for travesty again in 2009. The question is, will other funders, particularly in Europe, will other NGOs that claim to promote universal human rights, like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and B'Tselem and other organizations, stand up and be counted and say, we will not participate again in a travesty like this in 2009? Thank you.
Okay. The next speaker is Dr. Emmanuel Ottolenghi, the Executive Director of the American Jewish Committee's Transatlantic Institute. He is a political scientist by training. He came to Brussels at the Transatlantic Institute in 2006 after he has previously taught Israel Studies at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies, and also at the Middle East Center of St. Anthony's College, Oxford University. He has held positions at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, University of New South Wales in Australia. He has a PhD at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and his undergraduate studies were at the University of Bologna. Emmanuel.
Thank you, Dr. Gerstenfeld, and thank you, of course, to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for organizing this conference. I am very glad to be here. It's always good to find an excuse to come to Jerusalem. On my way to Jerusalem, I asked myself whether this conference could be organized today in prestigious European university. I had the great honor to teach in one such institution for 8 years. And so I asked myself, could I organize one conference if I was still there? One conference like this one? And the answer, after some thinking, was yes, I could. Of course, the difference would be that I would have to invite approximately, as half of the participant, people who would question Israel's legal and historical rights in order to get the authorization and clearance to organize one such forum. And I think that if I try to imagine the lineup of academics coming, probably all of them, most of them, if not all of them, would be Jewish. Half of them would be Israeli. Let me give you an example. I'm not just being funny. In January 2005, a very prestigious debating society organized in London a debate where the motion was, this House believes that Zionism today is the worst enemy of the Jews. I'll leave it to you to guess whether the motion passed or lost, and by which margins. But let me tell you what the lineup was. 3 in favor, 3 against. The 3 in favor of the motion were Professor Avi Schleim, Professor Jacqueline Rose, and journalist Amira Haas. So depending on how you define Israeli, it's either 2 Israelis and 1 Jew, or 1 ex-Israeli, 1 Israeli and 1 Jew. Against the motion, Melanie Phillips, Rafi Israeli, and Shlomo Ben-Ami. So here you had 3 or 4 Israelis, depending how you count, and 2 or 3 members of the British Jewish community arguing in favor and against the motion, Israel is the worst enemy, Zionism is the worst enemy of the Jews, in front of approximately 1,000 members of the Greater London community. This is by no means an exception. The debates that were mentioned before by Ambassador Gold at the Oxford Union, several others at Cambridge and in other places, all featured similar lineups. It's always a group of Jewish intellectuals, Israeli intellectuals, being brought forth, given a platform to provide a very strong case against Israel's right to exist. Not criticize Israel or its policies or this policy or that policy, but to question and undermine Israel's right to exist. And indeed, in the acrimonious debate that accompanies the Middle East, in Europe, those who reject accusations of anti-Semitism, even in those extreme circumstances where anti-Semitism is plain for all to see, for example, the comparison of Israel to Nazis, the use of the imagery of the blood libel, or the description of Israelis as Christ killers in order to comment on events in the conflict. People who reject this accusation, I was saying, often use two discursive techniques to fend off criticism. First, they dismiss accusation of anti-Semitism as blackmail. And go on, and that's the second technique, they go on to rely on Jewish anti-Zionists as proof that their hostility is discerning, not against all Jews, but only against those Jews who dare to support Israel's right to exist. They often cite them as the sources of their information and frequently produce their rhetoric and their writings as evidence of Jews arguing much the same against Israel. And they claim that given such company and such similarity of discourse, they can hardly be accused of anti-Semitism. If Jews say it, it must be kosher. And so central to this argument is the rhetoric that some anti-Zionist Jews espouse about the Jewish morality of opposing Israel, the need to voice opposition to Israel and its very existence in the name of Jewish values, which in effect provides succor to anti-Israel rhetoric. This rhetoric, interestingly enough, and I think this is the new element of our current discourse, is that it is a discourse about saving the Jews from themselves. It is a salvation that depends on ending Zionism and its consequences. And it is therefore, for all intents and purposes, a linguistic mandate to destroy the Jewish state articulated by Jews in the name of Jewish values and for the sake of the Jewish people. So I said the first part of the argument dismisses accusation of anti-Semitism by insinuating that they're used as a form of blackmail to silence all criticism of Israel. Think of Walton Mearsheimer, for example. Think of Jimmy Carter. And the second technique, of course, follows from the first. Once Jews are discredited for their alleged attempts to gag critics of Israel, Jewish intellectuals are then brought in to endorse such hateful rhetoric and substance, and they're cited basically as the alibi against accusation of anti-Semitism. Now, this is not always mentioned, but many detractors of Israel will seek validation for statements that would be particularly offensive to Jews by invoking a Jewish or an Israeli source, putting the emphasis on the ethnic or religious origin of that source rather than the merit of its argument. A Jew or an Israeli, this logic goes, somehow sterilizes the statement, makes it kosher, makes it legitimate. I mentioned Walton Mearsheimer. There are many examples. In England, for example, there are two frequent commentators of the conflict, John Pilger, who perhaps is a more extreme example, but Anatol Lieven, frequent Financial Times columnist, who has in the past evoked the, I quote, iron grip of the Jewish lobby, end of quote, over U.S. foreign policy and its alleged ability to stifle public debate, and always mentions the Jewish ancestry of people who disagrees with him to delegitimize their argument, and the Jewish ancestry of people who would agree with him in order to strengthen the argument. And these are not exceptions. Accusations of Zionist influence, of Zionist control, of Zionist conspiracies are usually accompanied by strong disclaimers on anti-Semitism that tend to invoke Jews, usually anti-Israel and anti-Zionist Jews, as proof and alibi for such views. And there are Jewish intellectuals who indeed comply with this call and offer themselves as a shield against accusations, thereby providing the kind of defense that anti-Semites need in a world where anti-Semitism has been banned from acceptable social and political discourse in order to hate the Jews without the stigma attached to prejudice and actually in the name of a legitimate, commendable moral crusade for justice and peace in the region. Alan Hart, British journalist, for example, reminds us in the introduction of a book called Zionism, the Worst Enemy of the Jews, that, quote, all of the most perceptive and the most devastating of Zionism critics were and are Jews. And if this is the case, of course, then the worst type of rhetoric against Israel can never be anti-Semitic, because Jews themselves have voiced it. And there is a further step in this process that turns anti-Semitic discourse into acceptable language, thanks to the alibi provided by Jews endorsing such rhetoric. And that is that any attempt to expose this discourse as anti-Semitic is instantly dismissed because it is presented an apology of Israel, which, according to the promoters of this argument, is indefensible. Israel and its founding ideology, Zionism, are presented not just as a threat to peace in the region, they're presented as a threat to world peace. They're also accused to hurt the Jews, the Jewish people first and foremost. The depiction of Israel as evil is presented as truth, and asking, therefore, as a consequence, that Jews distance themselves from evil is seen as an attempt to save them from abuse, the abuse of anti-Semitism, which derives not from prejudice, but supposedly from attachment to and sympathy for Israel. Just give you a few examples. Justin Keating, Irish intellectual, wrote in 2005 the following, quote, Jews have made an immense contribution to civilization. Thank you very much. Developing as they were between the great empires of Mesopotamia and the Nile, with both of which they had intimate contact and by which they wanted to avoid being swallowed. They developed a religion and an ethos based on independence, liberty, and democracy for which we all owe a debt. That was the past. That religion is based on the twin concepts of law and righteousness, which inspired over the millennia extraordinary contributions to culture and morality. All admirable. In Israel-Palestine, where are they now? Zionists have betrayed all of this, and that is a tragedy, not just for Jews, but for all of us. End of quote. So Zionism is depicted as a betrayal of Judaism, which invites anti-Semitism on account of its actions. Jews would do better to denounce it and become responsible for their own suffering in their failure to do so. And of course, this kind of rhetoric is endorsed and gravitates around the idea of what it means to be Jewish in today's world, and it is fed into by both Jews and non-Jews. And I'm going to give you a few examples. Max Hastings, conservative commentator in Great Britain, wrote in 2006 the following words, quote, younger Europeans, not to mention the rest of the world, are more skeptical about Israel's territorial claims. They're less susceptible to moral arguments about redress for past horrors, which have underpinned Israeli actions for almost 60 years. We may hope that it will never become respectable to be anti-Semitic. However, Israel is discovering that it can no longer frighten non-Jews out of opposing its policies merely by accusing them of anti-Semitism. There's a stark logic that follows from his and similar language. If Jews refuse to oppose Israel's policies, they will pay a price. 2 more minutes. Thank you. And far from expressing a prejudice, these advocates of Jewish self-indictment are actually persuaded that to say so is for the welfare of the Jews. Let me give you a few examples. October 2001, Barbara Spinelli, a frequent commentator in the Italian third daily newspaper La Stampa, who defined Israel as ultra-nationalist and called it a scandal. A scandal, of course, first and foremost for the Jews, given that, as any European would know, the Jews are deemed to be the ultimate victims of modern nationalism. And it follows that, therefore, the Jews have a special duty to denounce Israel, defend the victims of Israel, and do so in public, lest they are suspected of complicity. And she writes, quote, "If there is one thing missing in Judaism, it's precisely this, a mea culpa, vis-à-vis populations and individuals who had to pay a price of blood and exile to let Israel exist." And she then proceeds to invite world Jewry to make an immediate public amend. Quote, "If the initiative does not begin in Jerusalem, then it should at least with the diaspora, where so many Jews experience a double and conflicting loyalty. To Israel and to the state they belong to and where they vote. A solemn mea culpa proclaimed by Jewish community dispersed across the West, that will stand by the West and will keep its ramparts, that will invite Israel's leaders to bring an end to abusive occupations, that will rebuild a religion that is not identified anymore with exalting the colonial state and the superiority of a people. All this could be an important start, beneficial even to the nation of Israel." I have plenty of other examples where Israel is called upon to convert, where Israel is accused of original sin. Remember, original sin is a Catholic Christian concept that means something that comes with birth and can be only washed away by embracing salvation through baptism. So how do you baptize Israel? By renouncing Zionism, and so on. There's plenty of examples, and all the time, Jewish intellectuals, Jewish scholars, Jewish spokespeople are invited to endorse this view and denounce Israel. And this function, which by no means is a majority trend within Jewish communities across the world, but it is significant among intellectuals, has become central to the discourse in the Western world that tries to delegitimize Israel, to separate Israel from the Jewish people, and to present Israel not just as an evil because of its supposedly terrible actions within the context of the Middle East, but also as the worst possible betrayal of Jewish authenticity. It is an attempt to reclaim Jewish identity as something completely devoid of a Jewish national identity, completely detached from the land of Israel, completely eradicated from anything else but a secular, post-nationalist, anti-Zionist understanding of Jewish identity. Thank you.
It's my pleasure now to call upon Trevor Esselson. Trevor is a well-known international litigation solicitor. He has worked for many years as the global head of international litigation of one of the leading British law firms. And he has come on Aliyah and set up his own, and I understand, flourishing law firm practicing international law from Jerusalem. I think Trevor is one of those other few people the Jewish people have really to be thankful for, because one block of our major enemies are the so-called hypocritic NGOs. Another major block are the so-called neutral media. Among media, undoubtedly, the BBC stands out, I would say, as the most biased, government-sponsored media in the Western world. It is thanks to Trevor that we have seen what, in my opinion, is the by far best analysis of systematically breaking down the system of defamation of a major media. His studies on the BBC really set the tone on how you show how people who claim to have ethical standards to a large extent are crooks. And Trevor shows that the BBC, from what I remember from reading his reports, Trevor shows that if the BBC has a certain number of guidelines, and he takes individual cases and shows that the BBC manages on several single cases to break more than half of its guideline on a single case, which I would say is really an interesting performance of journalism, and I'm very glad to invite him here.
Thank you. I think that's what's known as a pregnant pause. Thank you very much to the JCPA and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. I believe that I've been asked to speak today as part of the comic relief because I'm going to be speaking about BBC impartiality. What I have done today, what I'm bringing you today, is an analysis which I think is possibly for the first time of BBC Arabic. BBC Arabic has been broadcast for some time on radio, and this month went live on television. The wonderful thing from the BBC's point of view about BBC Arabic is almost the only people that understand what they're saying, and therefore the only people that are likely to criticize it are Arabic speakers, and there's a relatively small number of them in the West. And possibly few of those are inclined to criticize what the BBC is actually putting about. What I want to just do is bring you some examples of what is actually being broadcast on BBC Arabic. And I'll just explain for a moment how I've done this. I took the main BBC News programme and recorded it for 4 weeks during the Lebanon War. I then translated all of the guest speakers, everything that was said by the guest speakers, and indeed the interviewers, and I've then tried to classify the guest speakers as to whether they are pro one side or the other side of the conflict or are neutral in their general approach. Now, sometimes it's not been terribly difficult. If one takes a spokesperson from Misrad Quds, one can assume they're pro-Israel. If you take a spokesperson from Hezbollah, then one can assume that they are pro-Hezbollah. Some of the speakers, of course, are more difficult to classify, but in fact what emerges is most of them are fairly clear, fairly easy to classify. Now I want to take you initially to, if I can, to one element of the BBC guidelines. This is the only bit of law which is coming into this talk. The BBC will tell you they have to be fair and neutral. That's not right. They actually have in their guidelines due impartiality does not require absolute neutrality on every issue or detachment from fundamental democratic principles. What this means, I believe, is that where you are faced with two different events, one has to recognize there isn't necessarily a moral equivalence between a terrorist attack and self-defense, and a nation, and a sovereign state employing its right of self-defense. So, for example, if one was looking at the way in which the BBC operated this obligation not to be detached from fundamental democratic principles, one would think that if it's faced with Hezbollah and Iran, Hezbollah, which the UK government recognizes as a terrorist organization, Iran, which is probably the greatest existential threat to the West today in terms of its nuclear aims and its genocidal ambitions. And then face that with Israel, which has all of the elements of a democracy. It has obviously representative government, it has a fair and independent judiciary, and it has a very free press. You would think that the BBC would be anxious to demonstrate that it has in fact not detached itself from fundamental democratic principles. If one looks therefore at the number of representatives that it invites to its programme, this is what we see. Hezbollah and Iran, 17, Israel, 5. More than 3 times as many go to the undemocratic than the democratic. Now let's just look at briefly what they talk about. I want to start off by just classifying some of the anti-American, which I take to be also anti-Western views which are expressed. And I've taken these quotations. There's a large schedule which you can get on the BBC Watch website, which contains the full quotations, of which these are obviously minor selections, but I believe properly representative of the attitudes of the speakers. The Bush government wanted to have complete control over the world which is controlled by the US. As we know, on the Arab street, if your enemy is Israel or America, you are on the right side. This is an interesting one for Condoleezza Rice. There is a kind of vision in the American government to crush the Palestinians completely and to take all their lands. I'm not quite sure where they get that from, but doubtless it's well known. The Americans constantly talk about breaking the hearts and minds of the Arabs and Muslims. This new American strategy is totally contrary to the principles of human rights. Hezbollah has been leading this fight with dignity and justice. The positions of Europe and America center on their own obsessions, their war on terror, and they have considered Hezbollah a terrorist group, which is, of course, wrong. These are the attitudes towards Israel. Now, we're talking about the delegitimization of Israel. Let's look at the way Israel is spoken about. Again, this is a representative sample of the attitudes which the BBC is putting out. Israel is said to have evil objectives, this way of twisting things, and the aggressive attitude. The Israeli military machine works to a great extent based on hatred. Israelis are violating all international law. It turns out there's every single one. They've carefully gone through and they're violating every single bit of international law. Then we get to the somewhat more hysterical language. We talk about the barbaric Israeli attack, the barbaric Israeli army. Lebanon is facing a barbaric war. These are all different, not necessarily everyone is a different person, but these are different quotations from different people. They are destroying villages completely. They are racist and barbaric. It gets a little bit more exciting. We are facing a monster who does not care about the law or about morals, a killer monster. Israel is the deadly monster, a destructive monster. They refer to a month of killing our children, and this is collective punishment, and good old famous canard, Nazi punishment. These are comments coming out on BBC radio, effectively uncontradicted by the person who's interviewing them. And now we get complete pure lies. They are committing massacres. The atrocities in Lebanon that we have seen so far from Israel, including all of their massacres. There's a large number of these massacres which some of the international press appear to have missed. There is a need for an assurance against further Israeli massacres. Israel, and now I'm going to just give you a few of the comments which are so ridiculous that I've put them under the heading absurd comments. Israel is a country that wants to expand, and they have a plan to force on to the regions of Palestine, Lebanon, and even Egypt. So these are the this is the colonialist ambitions which Israel has. The fact that they've withdrawn from all of these places is not actually mentioned. All the massacres committed by Israel, like no one in history has seen something similar. It is even worse than what Germany committed. Now, those of you who've studied some history will find that an interesting comparison. Barbaric Israel attacks, I love this one, which kills everybody, everywhere. We should be very grateful that we're still alive. Israel is extensively targeting every part of Lebanon. What was absolutely noticed by everybody is that they were only targeting the southern part of Lebanon, which is where Hezbollah was. These are crimes unprecedented historically. Turns out that they are unprecedented historically, and all students of history, please take note. We'd be very interested to see the comparisons. If any of you want to conduct some further studies, you might consider going to hear Dr. Anwar Ashki, the director of the Middle East Center for Strategic and Legal Studies in Saudi Arabia. Strategy and law obviously being his strong points. He's obviously got an interesting view on history as well, and he came out with this gem. We faced Israel in 1967 and won militarily. These, again, this is a hysterical, extreme views which are being put across, not by Al Jazeera, not by Al Arabi, but being put across by the BBC, funded by British taxpayers to the tune of $8 billion a year. They are putting out, they're the most powerful news organization in the world. Because they have legal obligations to be fair and impartial, they have considerable weight. And they are giving weight to these extreme views. Let's just look at some dangerous comments, which is extraordinary given British and Western foreign policy are being stated. Of course, we have Hezbollah referred to as martyrs, the honour resistance. Again, Hezbollah are clear that their operation targeted military objectives is clear that their operation targeted military objectives, not civilians, as did Israel. In fact, there was a blanket attack of missiles which were not guided at all and killed a number of civilians in Israel. And this is extraordinary. I hope that Iran has something to scare Israel. As an Arab citizen from the Middle East, I wish that all Arab countries would have nuclear weapons. This is being put out by something organised, paid for by the British taxpayer, partly funded by the British Foreign Office. This is not consistent with British foreign policy, as far as I understand it, that all Arab countries would have nuclear weapons. I will ask Iran and every Arab country, this is a completely separate comment, and every Arab country you can, to have nuclear weapons. This is the BBC's Arabic service in radio, and of course television is far more powerful than radio, and television started, I think, last week. I've taken out the neutrals, which there were a very small number. We have pro-Hezbollah 82%, pro-Israel 18%. So you get an idea. This is the attachment to fundamental democratic principles. This is the way the BBC understands it. And almost nobody that doesn't speak Arabic can see this. It's invisible to everyone. Now I'm going to end by having a very, very quick look at another study. There's a copy of that study is going to be out in the hall when you go and take coffee, and there's going to be copies of another study out in the hall, which I'm just going to flick through for 3 minutes. Do I have 3 minutes left? Right. A study which I carried out. It was particularly interesting because it gives a view of the way the BBC journalists think. There is a tiny corner of the website called The World in Pictures. And a journalist is asked, almost at random, in the morning, at the end of the morning meeting, and I've interviewed the head of the website who's explained this to me, told, you go and do the World in Pictures today. And they throw 10 or 12 pictures onto the website, and those 10 or 12 pictures are meant to be, just interesting things going on in the world, and also in some way or other summarize world events. I looked at 6 months' worth of pictures. That's 10 or 12 over 6 months. I took out all the ones which related to Israel, Palestine, not the whole of the Middle East, but also including Iraq. And this was a couple of years ago, was the period that I looked at. And it's fascinating to see. And I then interviewed the head of the website, and I said, are you monitoring these? Are you looking to see whether or not there are pro-Israel or anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, Palestinian? And he said, are you mad? Why should I monitor it? It's just a little bit of the website. I just asked one of my journalists to throw a few pictures up towards the beginning of the day. How can I monitor that? In other words, what he said was, there are a few things about which we consider an obligation to monitor, but by no means everything. And they actually were surprised that someone should be asking that they monitor whether or not they monitor their own product. What we therefore get is, over a 6-month period, the pictures which go up effectively are a window into the soul of the journalists that are selecting those pictures. They reflect in a natural way what these journalists think about the correct way the world should be presented. And let's just have a look at this. So this is, I call it Pictures of Prejudice, and this is a breakdown of the political images. It's interesting, that tiny little slither you see there is Darfur, where at the time there were ethnic cleansing, massacres, millions of people being thrown out of their homes, government-sponsored attacks on individuals. That received one picture in 6 months. The rest of the world had the majority. Iraq, where the Iraq war was at its height, received about the same as Israel, where the only thing that was going on, the Intifada, had finished, and the only thing that was going on was Israel was getting ready to withdraw from Gaza. So even when nothing effectively is happening in Israel, it receives as much attention as Iraq, and about 20 times what Darfur is receiving. Looking at the breakdown with some neutrals, I'll take you to without neutrals, and there you see the good old, they're consistent. You've got to admit the BBC is consistent, about 20% pro-Israeli, about 80% pro-Palestinian. And I'm just going to show you some of the pictures. In theory, it's not always easy to tell whether a picture is pro or anti any particular group. But let's look at a few and you'll see how I haven't found it so difficult to classify. First of all, Palestinians, it turns out, if they are male, are unarmed and generally praying. So we have here Palestinians in prayer, The men tend to be unarmed and often elderly. Palestinians in prayer. Very frequently, Palestinians are shown as female, often children, and usually clutching the photographs of their loved ones brothers, husbands that are incarcerated for no apparent reason by the ghastly Israeli Zionist colonialist entity. So we have this kind of picture here, all holding the pictures of all of their loved ones that are being held by Israelis in Israeli prisons. Here's one whose father has just been released, another one here, and yet another one here. This is a constant image, very attractive, beautiful faces, pathetically touching the picture of his older brother. No mention ever as to why that older brother might be in prison somewhere, just these images of these pathetic children parted from their brothers and fathers, or whatever. There's one more. Israel is depicted almost entirely male, armed, and very often their faces are covered so that you can't actually see them. They're faceless individuals. So we see, for instance, this individual, you can see that it's an Israeli soldier, but you can't actually see the features of the face. Here's a particularly nice picture, the harmless elderly Palestinian with this, the symbol of Israel is just the gun held anonymously pointing at him. I think it's a slightly amusing picture because it's taken a moment too early. It's obviously posed, and the guy is smiling, and I don't think that was intentional. He's meant to look terrified and threatened, but unfortunately the one they put up was a little bit early. Here we have a typical Israeli soldier, sandbagged, with his helmet and the light not really able to see in his features. All you see is the weapon and the sandbags. And I love this picture. Where you do see Israeli soldiers' faces, there's 5 armed Israelis around one apparently kneeling Palestinian woman. The caption, each picture has a caption. Here you do see Israelis haughty, standing around in a rather haughty fashion. This is Yom HaZikaron. This is the way the BBC decides to portray that particular event. The one typical pro-Jewish picture is, of course, of the Holocaust, Yom HaShoah, and here you've got a pathetic, dead, persecuted, homeless, stateless Jew. You can put forward in a sympathetic light, and they're the ones that get the sympathetic coverage. Compare that with the way the Palestinians are presented. Here you've got this beautifully composed picture with the light just shining upon this dignified, elderly, harmless-looking gentleman in his very impoverished surroundings. Here we have a picture of a typical Palestinian scene, which we're all very familiar with, fishing, and another very typical, this is an armed Palestinian, in case you hadn't noticed that. He's got a pitchfork, evoking this delightful image of harmless, charming people in this rustic scene who wouldn't hurt a fly. Where you do see the Palestinian police, they're disciplined and entirely unarmed, which is quite interesting. And finally, the Malaysian elections. One might wonder why the Malaysian elections are selected here, but as soon as you see the way the Malaysian elections are portrayed by the BBC and the World in Pictures, you'll understand why I've chosen them. How better to portray and explain the Malaysian elections than to show a apparently Malaysian woman walking past a wall of 4 posters depicting peace in Palestine. And if you look a little closer, it's difficult to see. Peace in Palestine, you've got a picture on the top left of each of these posters of 2 little children holding hands, and in the background an Israeli tank moving towards them. And the picture below is 2 other Palestinian children sitting on a heap of rubble, which presumably is the remains of their house after the tank has done its business. This is, of course, the way in which most people think of the Malaysian elections, and therefore I can understand exactly why they've done it. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the way the BBC uses its power, the way the BBC impartially presents what's going on in the Middle East, and this, ladies and gentlemen, is the way in which the BBC delegitimizes the State of Israel. Thank you.
Questions? Where are the cards? No questions? No? Okay. one question there. We'll take that. Another question there. Okay, we have a few minutes. And the third question there. We'll take 3 questions.
Hello, my name is Boris Sovic. I'm the ambassador of Republic of Slovenia, and we have the current EU presidency. I think it was very important to hear opinion about EU position. I would like to stress that indeed European Union has very strong relations with Israel. Israel is involved in several programs, agencies, and I think that everybody tries to even increase these relations, to upgrade them. And indeed, there is such discussion now ongoing. And I would like to tell you that I believe that much can be done and will be done in this sense. European Union, of course, always also supports NGOs. This is part of our life. This will be also in the future so. But if there are any questions about financing of NGOs, I'm sure that if you would like to have such information as it was raised today, we will provide you with all the data, and I would like to invite you to the meeting in EU delegation here in Israel, and this is part of our art, how European Union is working. All financial sources are open, are under very strict control, and if somebody from the public would like to see them, of course, all the data are available. So I just would like to invite you to look the numbers, and of course, then much things can be clearer. Thank you.
You take the questions first. No, I have. Sorry, we have the second question there, and the other. No,
Hi, I'm a visiting professor right now at Hebrew University Law School, and I teach at New York Law School this past semester. I am interested in knowing why with Durban we talk about the apartheid and not accuse back the Arab world of apartheid against the Jews from the Arab countries, as well as ethnic cleansing of the Jews from Arab countries, since there's less than 5,000 Jews left in Arab countries out of the 900,000 that existed there.
Is this better? Yeah. I would like to say to the ambassador of Slovenia, if he wants to read how the European Union is totally obscure on its financing, I would suggest to him that he reads on the JCPA website the interview with former parliamentarian, Europarliamentarian, the Dutch Europarliamentarian, Rijk van Dam. If he reads that, he will see how Commissioner Patton, in charge of foreign affairs at the EU, has systematically sabotaged all information on the financing of the Palestinians. Now I'll ask Gerald, Professor Steinberg, to answer the other questions.
Thank you. The questions were good ones, and I think that it's good to look at all four of these presentations as fitting together as pieces of a puzzle. The NGO issues very much impact. I was listening to Trevor's and watching Trevor's presentation, and many of the quotes and attitudes that we see expressed in the BBC Arabic service very much reflect the language that's used by the NGOs. The indiscriminate bombing, Israel's the worst in the world, all of those sorts of things, and worst in history, one would, I wouldn't say logically conclude from, but almost from the type of NGO reports that are out there. Referring to the issue of European funding, Mr. Ambassador, with all due respect, we've spent at least 6 months talking to many European officials, writing letters, having meetings, and Europeans will always say, the officials, and there are many, will say, yes, we have a policy of complete transparency, but. And when you ask them, give us a list of the NGOs funded by ECHO, which amount to tens of millions of euros a year, that we can't give you. That is, they don't use the word top secret, but that is exactly what they're saying. We don't have it available. You have to look at our website, but the website only has broad categories. There is a huge amount of secrecy in this area because a lot of this funding is illegitimate. A lot of this funding is used for political warfare, And to answer the third question, there is an obsession about Israel, and Durban is a very, actually all three questions fit together. All the NGO community, using the language, the rhetoric of international law and human rights, has a very strong obsession with Israel. Also, it was interesting, the graph that Trevor showed about comparing, you saw this little sliver of Darfur in terms of the BBC Arabic coverage, and 95% on other areas. Well, we also compared, I didn't have time to show you that slide, but if you look at the ways in which the NGOs, the large NGOs, have dealt with Darfur, and compared the resources that are put into that, compared to the resources that are related to Israeli issues, it's almost exactly the same ratio. You almost don't find Darfur up there, except in the last 2 or 3 years, when it became more of a public issue. So I think these things, the obsession is very strong. It comes back again to the funding. The question of why the funders are allowing the money to be used for that, not just the EU, but there are in every Western European country, there are development and aid agencies, DFID in Britain, in Sweden, in Switzerland, not just the EU, Norway, and they will add 10, 15, 20 million euros, kroner, whatever the currency is, into the same pot, so that our study only deals with the EU, but in fact it is a much broader European phenomenon. The question that was asked, I don't see where you are, the visiting professor from NYU who's at Hebrew University. The Durban has to be looked at as a political process. And many of these things, just like the United Nations Human Rights Council, is a political process with a facade of using international law. And that's exactly the part of this conference and the international law program that the JCPA has developed and Avi Bell is leading, looking at the way in which international law has been distorted. Durban has been hijacked and used to attack Israel. It happened much earlier than the actual Durban conference, when the PrepCon was decided to take place in Tehran, and there were not going to be any Israelis or any Jews there, despite the promises that Mary Robinson said that, of course, the Iranian government has promised to give visas. Then the agenda was set, the language of the declaration was written, and everything else afterwards was just minor commentary. To change that agenda, the debate is taking place. There are those who argue that we can go and engage in the debate of before Durban 2009 and change the agenda. Others, like Ann Bayevsky, say that this is already hopeless because the deck has been stacked so badly against Israel in this process. So to change the agenda, start focusing on Arab racism, is almost impossible. I think it makes sense to wait until the April PrepCom in Geneva, at least they're not going to Tehran this time, and see if there's any possibility of movement. But if it turns out that it's the same people, the same agendas, the same NGOs, then it's hopeless. And while your point is a good one, I think that realpolitik has to take place.
Just a word to further comment on what Jerry said, and to answer the ambassador from Slovenia who represents the EU during the Slovenian presidency. First of all, I want to thank you for your comment and acknowledge here Europe has not always been at the end of complimentary language in the last 7 years, 8 years here in Israel, and I think that you are absolutely right. At the political level, there has been a marked improvement in relations between the EU and Israel. There is cooperation in all fields. Israel is treated by the European Union in a very preferential way, given that Israel is not a member. It is the only non-EU country that participates in research and development, scientific projects, Galileo, and various other things. And this is important, and it's crucial to emphasize this fact. I don't want to comment on NGOs funding in Israel and the Palestinian territories, but I do want to say a word about the EU funding other activities for civil society in the region. And I think that that is a telling factor about things that could be improved. We had a hearing at the European Parliament about a year ago on Syria, where the Commission representative in Damascus attended and spoke about EU funding to Syria in the context of the Barcelona process and the Mediterranean dialogue. And what it emerged from his briefing, and indeed you're right, it is all transparent and it is available on the website of the Commission representation in Damascus, most of the money that the EU gives to Syria does not go to NGOs. It actually goes to improve the infrastructure and it is funneled through governmental institutions. The only NGO in Syria that receives European money, according to the website of the Commission, receives less than 500,000 euro for a 6-year project to improve rural village micro-business for women, and it is an NGO that is chaired by the wife of His Excellency the President of Syria. So you could question also the independence of this. And when the representative was questioned about the validity of this approach and whether it was actually a waste, he kind of acknowledged that unfortunately that it was the only funding the Syrians were interested in, and then he was pressed to answer, well, what are you going to do about it? And he said, well, we have seized 150 million euro funding for the next 4 years. We will continue to do what we're doing. So obviously there is a problem there. It is important to fund NGOs, and some NGOs do good work around the world, but it is important to be discerning, I think, and especially looking at the context of this region. It is remarkable that a lot of EU money comes to Israel to fund organizations that sometimes actually try to undermine the very legitimacy of Israel's existence, not just to improve human rights and civil rights in this country, when on the other side the European Union is supporting, for all intents and purposes, the stability of very undemocratic regimes in the region.
Gerald, last word.
Emmanuel said it very well. This is not a general problem with all NGOs. There is a specific obsession having to do with Israeli-Palestinian issues. And it would certainly be a welcome opportunity to work with the EU. I found out in discussing these issues with your ambassador here, Sibio, and others, that in fact many European officials in the political end do not realize how little transparency is in this specific area, specifically related to Israel and Palestinian issues, and how much of that money goes to policies which undermine and contradict the EU policies. And so if we have this information, and we have some copies of the draft report here that we can give you and others, and if we can work with you on that, I think that would be a very important step in improving the cooperation that is developing between Israel and the EU.
Thank you. We have now a break of about 25 minutes.